pieces. So Caroline, please take it away.
Okay, great. So I will start by talking about the origins of this project, or the origins as I see it, and I'll move from that into talking about a major purpose and perhaps some key objectives of this text. So part of this project started for me in thinking about my dissertation project and looking at biopolitics in a neoliberal context, and trying to get at exactly what it was I was doing in an intervention with biopolitics. And I guess a key moment for me was an interview with Elizabeth Pivanelli, where she's talking about her work in geontology, and the interviewers characterized studies of biopolitics as primarily focused on the state, or primarily focused on state analysis, state level, and that it would characterize death and death-making on massive scale, or as though it was always caused by a state actor or an actor of the state. And I recognized that that's not really what I was doing, so it pushed me to try and figure out exactly what it was that I was saying about biopolitics. So then it led me to think about the ways in which death functions in more subtle ways in neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, not so much as it is promoted or a part of a state actor or of the state. So more of a systems analysis of the ways in which neoliberalism functions, whether it's through competition or intensification or the maximization of the body so that it can compete, increase in stress. The idea for me was that it wasn't always a state actor killing individuals, but that individuals, through exposure to stress over long periods of time, might die from heart disease or other endemic illnesses or endemic stress. And that was, to me, a type of death in neoliberalism, and that might actually be the modus operandi of neoliberal biopolitics, is to produce conditions where individuals seemingly die by natural causes. There's no one to blame, when in fact there are systemic reasons for why individuals are dying from particular illnesses or particular events that won't be recognized as state violence or be recognized as deserving of our attention, because it just seems like something natural, like that's just how it is. So then for me it became a matter of disentangling biopolitics from a necropolitics, and necropolitics is the term that is often used to describe the death-making of biopolitical governmentality or systems. So that's kind of where I took the project, and that's where we came together to try and figure out a way to, it's not so much to defend biopolitics, but to disentangle it from this focus on state-level studies of wide-scale or massive level or strong state killing. So then that can take me to our purpose, and one of the major purposes of this text is to rectify what we considered a troubling trend in critical IR and political theory circles that embarked upon the study and problematization of biopower and biopolitics. And so what I was suggesting earlier is that traditionally this study has largely been characterized as a study of the state or of the state level. And that death primarily functions by a state killing its citizens or a non-state actor killing individuals in horrific events. So this ignores the many modes of ordinary death and death-making that define but also make possible contemporary regimes of biopolitical governmentality. So then the goal is not to suggest that we should focus on one at the expense of the other, but to broaden the analysis and suggest that we don't have to just do biopolitical studies that focus primarily on state actors or the ways in which states eliminate certain populations so as to enhance or maximize or ensure that desired populations live. So then a key objective of this volume is to explore and theorize the close kinship between necropolitics, or even what you could call biopolitics. You don't necessarily need a necropolitics to talk about the ways in which death functions in biopolitical regimes. So if necropolitics in the everyday, the mundane, the banal, the ordinary, that which seems like just the way things are. So geopolitics is purposefully targeted by this volume, since instances of biopolitics and necropolitics never take place in abstract ways or forms. So they function in war zones, in camps, and across sovereign nations, and across territories deemed to be outside the law, but what others in the text and what I suggest also function within homes, within cities, within gyms, within spaces that aren't often recognized as war zones, or in spaces where you would expect massive scale death to actually happen.
Great. So for my part here today, I will try to give you a sense of what the chapters that are gathered in the book are trying to do in relation to the key themes that Caroline has explained and introduced. So let me give you a sense of what some of the chapters in the book are trying to do and how they relate to the thematics presented here. So the first chapter in the book after our introduction is a chapter by Caroline herself. It's a chapter that is in fact a bit of a theoretical anchor for the rest of the book. And one of the key things that Caroline shows in this chapter, going back to what she just mentioned, is that Achille Mbembe's notion of necropolitics, which of course many of you are very familiar with, often becomes quite superfluous, particularly with regards to Foucault's concept of biopolitics and biopower. Among other things, Foucault's biopolitics, Caroline argues, does more than just, quote, theorize biological racism or genocide, which is what Mbembe claims. In fact, biopolitics, probably even more than Mbembe's necropolitics, has the capacity to draw our attention to what Caroline calls in here, I quote her, ordinary or taken for granted deaths and death-making that are characteristic of neoliberalism and neoliberal spaces. And so, what we advance as a notion of necrogeopolitics in our volume, we suggest, would do well to take into account Foucault's biopolitics, of course, but also the range of possibilities that could be drawn from Foucault's notion of biopower and taken by scholars like Elisabeth Povinelli or Loïc Vacan, or maybe even Lisa Marie Cacho, among others, authors that, whose work Caroline introduces in the chapter. And so Caroline's chapter then opens up very nicely in a way that helps us to flow into a couple of chapters that follow hers, one by Alex Barter, another one by Ben Meaches. Barter's chapter examines the notion of political incompetence as he puts it, a way of letting death happen in contemporary politics, particularly in some geographical settings that many of you are, I think, familiar with, such as post-2001 Afghanistan, post-2003 Iraq, post-Katrina New Orleans. But another space that Barter looks at more closely in his book is actually Greece after, it's almost like 10 years ago now already, after the EU imposed austerity measures, right? So weaving his argument through writers like Hannah Arendt, Alexis de Tocqueville, and also George Orwell, Barter targets in his chapter what often gets to be labeled as modes of unsuitable governance of certain populations. An unsuitable governance that often leads to death-making or that accompanies or results from structural or endemic forms of political incompetence. Then immediately after that, we have a chapter by Ben Meaches, who looks at the role and place of social death in theories and analysis of genocide today. So interestingly, Meaches moves away from the paradigmatic view that genocide is primarily a form of physical violence. As we know the definition of genocide to be, and we've known it for decades now, physical deaths on a massive scale. Not, of course, to deny the existence or the atrocity of those physical deaths on a massive scale, of course. course, but rather to suggest that genocide often crucially operates by way of what he calls destruction of social bonds, social vitality, and social worlds as well. So drawing insights from the work of philosopher Catherine Malabou on plasticity and the brain in particular, and of social theorist who has written on social death, Claudia Card, Mises explains that social death theory is premised upon the idea that forms of life also have material effects that exceed the fact of physical death of individuals or populations, even on a broad scale. Then we have a chapter by somebody who many of you know, Francine Rosson de Paola, Aspect alum, and now a faculty member at Queen's University in Belfast. And in her chapter, Francine looks at the mundaneness of killing and death, in fact, both social and physical death, in a spatial context of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Francine targets political discourses, urban policies, police and military operations deployed in the name of pacification or in fact, even beautification of the city of Rio. Here, Francine connects aesthetics and the need to aestheticize to the symbolic, often cartographic, but also the physical removal or disappearance of the poorest segments of the populations of Rio, and their disappearance from the urban landscape writ large. And she mobilizes, but also problematizes, the notion of herbicide as a mundane modality of annihilation of certain forms or ways of life. Following Francine's chapter, we have a couple of chapters by Gita Duplessis, who writes on Scandinavian, in particular Danish social welfare, and the Danish social welfare model or system, and a chapter shows how such a good liberal, in fact neoliberal model, allegedly good, is dependent upon, in fact, global modalities of exploitation, inequality, and death, particularly migrants' death, in or from the global south. And this chapter is immediately followed by a chapter by Jessica Octor that targets global or Western statistical measurements of deaths from the global south. Jessica Octor shows how statistical measurements, and particularly the tallying of rates of mortality in the south, do not allow certain deaths or forms of death or modes of killing to rise to the level of a health crisis or a global health crisis. And you can imagine those which don't and those which do not. While at the same time, certain pathologies often leading to death from the south are simply represented as endemic, once again, inevitable, common, banal, or in fact normal. Following those two chapters, there is an interesting chapter by Samuel Pondo and Mike Shapiro. In that chapter, they continue to investigate, in fact, the issue of which deaths or which forms of death-making matter under generalized conditions of neoliberal insecurity. Interweaving novels and films in their work, Opondo and Shapiro focus on the forensic work of international organizations and their work, in particular, in relation to tracking down migrations, migrants, and migrant movements. Very cleverly, I think, by turning to literature and cinema, Opondo and Shapiro bring forward what they call a counter-forensic approach, one that can shift the focus towards what they call the lives and deaths, such as those of migrants, the lives and deaths that exist below the threshold of scientific attention or forensic detectability. The next chapter is a chapter by Ali Mosleh, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii. And his chapter is on the routinization or normalization of death-making in Palestinian lands, and in Gaza in particular. And Mosleh examines how the Israeli state and military's apparatus of security and weaponry places people in Gaza in particular under a constant gaze, but also a constant gaze that can turn lethal, in fact does turn lethal, at any moment. In chapter 9, the chapter that comes after Mosleh's chapter, Brent Steele and Stephen Michael Christian return to the aesthetics and death relationship. That is also a bit of some theme in the volume. And here they focus on the phenomenon of the death or deaths of communism, as they put it. And in particular on communism's many afterlives or hauntings. And they do so by looking at kitsch, in particular kitsch artistic productions and objects, and how they relate to the matter of the ever ongoing, everlasting dying or death of forms of communism. And last but not least, before, in fact, a brief epilogue to the volume by Kenan Ferguson, we have a chapter, which is in fact a final book-ending chapter, by our own Mauro Caraccioli. Mauro draws from Marx's notion, I'll be careful what I say because it's right there. Mauro draws from Marx's notion of world historical necromancy to problematize the trope of the Earth's dying body. And among other things, Mauro argues that necromantic narratives about the Earth's impending, if not already realized, death or destruction, take over contemporary necrogeopolitical discourses and debates, and crucially, saturate critical possibilities, thus preventing us, perhaps, from facing more pragmatically the many daily structural ecological forms of violence and death that are key to today's neoliberal condition. So that's about it. I'm hoping that this gives you a sense of what the volume is about. I will mention that we have a few flyers about the book in the back of the room, so here's your Valentine's gift. Buy it.